And so without further ado, we have the next presentation, another student whose project has evolved quite a bit, Sofia Silveira-Florek, talking about Bolsonaro's YouTubers, the imagined America of Brazilian neoconservatism, which was supervised also by Sumita Chakravarty and also Carol Wilder. So, Sophia, you should be able to share your screen.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Can you guys see both screens and hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
So first, thank you so much for being here. My name is Sophia, and this is the title of my thesis, Bolsonaro's YouTubers, the Imagined America of Brazilian Neoconservatism. Hopefully, by the end of this presentation, we'll have broken down each of the elements present in this title, and they will seem very interconnected. Before we begin, I'd like to give a shout out to my advisor, Professor Sumita Chakravarty. Sumita is great, and she played an integral part not only throughout the thesis process, but also on my overall master's degree experience, so thank you. I would also like to thank my second reader, Professor Carol Wilder. Carol is brilliant, and she offered such thoughtful feedback on the final product and how I can develop the questions asked here into new future research projects. So a little bit of context, I am Brazilian. I was born there, I grew up there, and my background is in sociology. Part of the reason why I chose sociology is because I've always been fascinated with the concept of a nation state, particularly how certain attributes are given to a nation state, sometimes by external actors, sometimes by internal ones, and more often by both. And those attributes can really influence a nation's cultural identity. While Brazil's ally up north, the United States, has been described by powerful voices in American culture as a beacon of democracy, land of the free, home of the brave. Brazil has been historically described by powerful voices in Brazilian culture as a joyful nation, filled with natural beauty and characteristically underdeveloped. That is what I wanted to talk about in my thesis. Growing up in Brazil, I was in contact with some of the various impacts the stigma of underdevelopment can have on a population. They are economic, historical, social, political, psychological, and one of the many reasons that made me fall in love with media studies is because all those different consequences manifest in media products. So I knew the universe that I wanted to talk about. And more than just the impacts of underdevelopment, I was curious about it because the word does not exist on its own. It actually brings with it a very particular worldview in which developed countries should serve as inspiration for underdeveloped countries. Therefore, underdeveloped countries should try to be developed countries. That is a very particular perspective, and I honestly prefer to take the route of intellectuals and other professionals that have tried to deconstruct that idea. So in my work, I use the terms geopolitical South to represent less rich countries with a history of colonization, and the geopolitical North to represent countries like the United States and continents that are part in continents like Europe. I prefer that dynamic, but most of the world still uses the term underdeveloped and developed. And underdeveloped countries should try to be developed. But if you really think about it, the category of geopolitical North is really complex. And if you consider the history that made the geopolitical north what it is, it's kind of impossible to see this polarizing dynamic as a reality. So what actually happens is underdeveloped countries should try to be a mediated version of developed countries, or what we perceive developed countries to be like, which is a very specific image. So I knew the macrocosm that I wanted to treat in my work, but I didn't really know how to extend it into an observable scenery that I could analyze in detail. After a lot of attempts, I looked back at my own home and the big political changes that were happening there. Brazilians elected this man, Jair Messias Bolsonaro, as the president of Brazil in October 28th, 2018. Bolsonaro was a former army captain and a defender of the dictatorship regime that governed Brazil in the 60s. He was elected on a platform that was pro-gun, pro-Reagan-like anti-welfare state governmental strategy, and he had the idea that Brazil was inherently a Christian country. It is not a coincidence that Bolsonaro was elected under the platform Brazil above everything and God above all. Bolsonarism is a political movement, and in my thesis, I refer to it as the combination of neoconservative ideals and neoliberal ones. The neoconservative side of Bolsonarism is really easy to spot and has been perfectly described by anthropologist Isabella Calil as the God, country, and family triad. And those are very specific definitions of God, country, and family, mind you. The neoliberal part of Bolsonarism is a little more tricky to understand, mostly because there's a lot of coded language that comes with it. So let's see a couple of declarations that came from Bolsonaro. The United States should be our sole partner in the exploration of the Amazon. It's very interesting that he said that, particularly considering the history of exploration of the United States. The United States did to other countries. So he was asked to explain himself. And he justified the first statement by saying, the UN's intentions are to eventually create multiple countries inside Brazil to get what is ours. That was a very interesting statement to me because it infers that the United Nations, which the United States helped to create and has been sort of the leader of it for a while, is actually in opposition to the United States. It has the idea that there is international organizations that are trying to take over the world, and the United States is defending free countries against those international organizations. It is not a coincidence that Bolsonaro, copying Trump, threatened to pull out of the World Health Organization just last week. Another statement of Bolsonaro that helps us understand how he views the world is early in his campaign, he said that he wouldn't negotiate with China at all because we don't want a country with an ideology behind it. I was very interested by that statement because it implies that countries like the United States, which he praised constantly, didn't have an ideology behind it. And that's a very specific view of ideology. And if you don't mind me saying, I think it's a very dangerous idea to see a country as beyond ideology, not a country, a government, if you will. It is also important to notice that Bolsonaro changed that speech after he got elected, and he even went to China. So things changed, but the statement was still there, and he got elected under a platform that defended those ideas. But it is important to understand that just like the dynamic between the geopolitical South looking to the geopolitical North, voters didn't look to Bolsonaro as Bolsonaro is. They looked at a mediated version of Bolsonaro. So just looking at Bolsonaro's own speeches wouldn't suffice my curiosity. Bolsonaro is much bigger than the movement that I call now Bolsonarism. He is just the public face of it, and that's very different. And Bolsonaro was elected under a very intense strategy that denied any forms of traditional media. And he actually asked for support of influencers. Most of his campaign was in social media, and he used bots. There is research that points to micro-targeting techniques being used by the Bolsonaro campaign. But nevertheless, he had an effective social media strategy. Despite the bots and everything, there was something in the speech of those influencers that made people want to vote for him. And that's what I wanted to understand. That was my research question. But formulating the research question was difficult because I didn't know exactly where to start. Thankfully, Bolsonaro gave me my research object because on his third day after he got elected, he he published on his social media excellent sources of information on YouTube. And he pointed to 6 YouTube channels. So I was like, perfect. I'm gonna look at what Bolsonaro considers excellent sources of information. And that can help me better understand what is this view of the United States and how can it be opposed to international organizations. With time, I started to understand that that was very connected to the idea of liberal hegemony, but we'll get to that in a minute. My research question was, what is the imagined America of the YouTubers selected by Bolsonaro as excellent sources of information? I wanted to understand what they thought America was. What was the true United States that opposed the UN? So with that in mind, I selected the channels and I made a database. I put on the date. I selected the specific days in which Bolsonaro made his campaign official. So it was official from August 13th until October 28th, the day of the election. Our elections are much shorter than the United States. And it's important to say that Bolsonaro informally campaigned for much longer than that. So I had my list of channels, I had the dates that I wanted to look at, and the rest of my database were tracking the videos that were published by those YouTubers during that date range. I put on my database the post description, keywords associated with the video, observations and thick descriptions of what I found in each of those videos, quotes, transcriptions of the videos, and a link to easily go back and watch again what I needed to investigate a little better. It is important also to notice that that was my minimal database. Like that was the least I could do to better understand this. But with time, I noticed that the YouTubers have their own language. So often I had to come back to other past videos to understand more what they were referencing to. So the database with time grew. But in that data range, my minimal database was made of 183 videos, and they had 13 minutes in average length. This is what the database looked like, just for you guys to catch an idea. And now I want to share a little bit of the statements I found in my research. So Nando Moura is one of those YouTubers, and he said the following: when the election is over, there will be music videos in this channel again. When this country is free, I will be able to breathe again. That statement is really powerful, and I put this as the first one because it is important to understand how significant those YouTubers were to the election. They mobilized their channels completely during the date range that I targeted. And during that time, they only talked about the election. They became a symbol of revolt happening in the country. So they often said that they were giving their lives to this cause of electing Bolsonaro. So all the speeches were very intense. And it is important to understand the intensity in which they not only they were made, but also they were received. I didn't analyze the comments at length, but if you take a look at any of the comments in the videos I saw, you will see that people responded with as much intensity as the YouTubers showed. It is important to say that Bolsonaro, and especially for his neoconservative side, was targeted by social justice movements, particularly movements that try to make sure that women weren't oppressed and seen only as, how can I describe? Well, pro-feminist social justice movements, and they really attacked Bolsonaro. You guys might not be Brazilian, but maybe you even heard of the campaign Not Him. It was an effort by multiple movements to try to bring attention to Bolsonaro's declarations against women. So the Not Him campaign became a powerful way in which people tried to stand up against his election. When trying to be against the Not Him campaign, Nando Moura declared, "Not him indeed. He didn't sell himself. He is not blackmailed by the," unfortunately I can't read much. Oh, I see that I can move you guys, sorry. Not him indeed. He didn't sell himself. He is not blackmailed by thugs. He is not corrupt. He doesn't pretend to be someone he is not. He is not running $1 million campaign. He doesn't give thugs an easy time. He doesn't want to see the country in the shit that it is. Summarizing, he is not a communist and he is not a socialist. That was a very interesting statement to understand what communism and socialism meant to those YouTubers. They associate, at first, there's no distinction for them in between communism and socialism. In my thesis, I even referred to their idea of the left as communism socialism because they make no distinction. It's just one big evil plan to defeat the free world. And in their world, that communist plan is connected to $1 million campaigns. So candidates that are not communists are not thugs, and they don't run $1 million campaigns. It is a very strict notion of corruption and evil being connected to their idea of the left, and virtue being connected to their idea of liberal countries, which we're going to see, as we're going to see later, their idea of liberal country is the United States. So this is Nando Moura, the YouTuber who said those statements. It is important to notice that in my research, I thought that I was only going to analyze their speeches, but it extended to much more than that. Sometimes you don't have to talk about the United States with your words. You can just have signs that point to it. For example, Nando Moura has a course about personal finances called Masters of Capitalism. If you notice with me, the logo for Masters of Capitalism is really resembles the colors of the United States flag. He also wears a top hat, and there's a helicopter in the shot, and two apparently expensive cars. And all those signs are important to construct what capitalism means to those YouTubers. In contrast, he made a parody of his own course called Masters of Socialism. First, please do notice that socialism is written wrong in Portuguese. And in his videos, Masters of Socialism, and you can see the communist flag there, Nando Moura invaded a home. It's his own home. And he has tattoos, and he speaks in a very specific, using very specific expressions that are historically connected to impoverished communities in Brazil, to the language developed in the favelas. So in Nando Moura's notion, the capitalists are powerful, strong, and rich, and the socialists are poor people who have he minimizes the favela culture and associates with criminality, and it is important to see those descriptions. And of course, it is not only connected to an idea of class, as we are going to see in I think 2 statements from this one. It is also connected to a very specific idea of race. Bernardo Custer is another one of the YouTubers, and in one of his videos he says, the first mistake in relation to the 2030 goals is to think it is only about world peace, sustainable development. Bernardo Custer goes on to say that the UN's plan is to eventually take over the world, which is exactly what Bolsonaro talked about in that initial statement I presented. Another one of his statements that I think are particularly interesting, it was when he said, the country is divided in between a gang that stole Brazil and the Brazilians that were stolen by a gang. It is funny when we talk about polarization. In Bernardo Custer's view and Bolsonaro's, the world is divided by only 2 poles, and they are exactly opposite, and you are either in the side of the good guys, the capitalists, or you're in the side of the communists. And we can see that in other countries of the world. So I hope this thick description of the YouTubers I encountered is not useful just for people who study Brazil, but neoconservative movements throughout the world. Olavo de Carvalho is another YouTuber, and I urge you to please, when you get a chance, take a look at his statements, because he has inspired a lot of Bolsonaro's ideology. He has written a lot of books, and those books are bestsellers, and he has been a powerful voice for neoconservatives. One of his he lives in the United States. That is also important. He says, I have lived in Virginia for 10 years and have never ever seen here any Black who is revolted, anti-white, or filled with hatred. And please, do note that here there are more Black people than in any other state. Black or white, all the members of the Commonwealth bear in their blood the heritage of Southern hospitality. The Virginia example is one the whole country should follow. It is interesting how he talks about Virginia in an ambiguous way, and you don't know exactly which country he's addressing. Should Brazil follow what he describes as the Virginia example, or should the United States? Diego Hawks is another YouTuber, and he had a very interesting sense of what are the good Americans and what are the non-good Americans. One of his big attacks was on George Soros, and he says, the biggest focus of George Soros' attacks is the United States, but he works all over the world. And he goes on to describe George Soros as a capitalist communist who takes all the money he gets in capitalist way and applies it to the communist cause. He goes on to describe the communist cause as drug decriminalization, euthanasia, LGBT ideology in the media, in the schools, and in the church, laws that favor thugs, laws that take weapons away from the goodwill population, feminism, and so on. So all those different movements, this amalgamation of causes, are all described as evil in the sense of those in these YouTubers' worldview. And that is really important to notice, because if you see the world in a polarized manner, there is no space for doubt. There is no space for discussion of any of those things because they are all on the evil side. And if the world is divided between the good guys and the bad guys, you don't argue with the bad guys. You annihilate them. The other two channels are translation channels. They focus on making montages of different videos and putting together different narratives, making the United States and Brazil one single narrative. Embassy of Resistance and Right-Wing Translators. One of the videos, for example, just to give you a sense of how they breach together different politicians from different times that don't necessarily have a lot to do with each other. Bolsonaro, Reagan, and Trump teach how not to be Venezuela. So then you have a video filled with declarations from Bolsonaro, Reagan, and Trump about very different things. And they polarize those things, all of them, like neoliberal statements that are very varied and most of the time out of context. And those three politicians would be in opposition to 2018 Venezuela, which they see as what the world would look like if the bad side wins. One of the videos called Globalism and Its History of Slavery has a sentence that was first said by Alex Jones that I think is very representative of the debate brought by those YouTubers when you're trying to investigate what is their sense of Americanism. And he said, it is Americanism against globalism right now. So guys, those are the YouTubers that I investigated. And after 183 videos and more, the imagined America of the YouTubers selected by Bolsonaro as excellent sources of information is one that is divided in between the good side of America and the bad side of it. On the bad side of America, the international organization side of America, to quote one of the YouTubers, you have publications like The Economist, the New York Times, CNN, the Democratic Party, BBC, every kind of place. And that debate is particularly important to have because just take a look at some of those institutions they said are the bad America and don't represent the real thing. They are such important portions of what I consider the United States to be. I really can't imagine talking about American history without talking about important social movements, without talking about publications like the New York Times or the Democratic Party. So their vision of what America would truly be is a very particular one. And I kept wondering, where did that came from? Where did this communist, socialist American culture in opposition to a real American culture came from? And that's what I had to ask next. My initial research question brought me another one. What groups collaborated to this perception? Howard Walt, in his book, The Hell of Good Intentions, describes how throughout its history, the United States in its foreign policy has prioritized two particular strategies: the idea of American primacy and the idea of liberal hegemony. American primacy is the notion that only the United States can lead the world. And liberal hegemony is the idea that any non-liberal form of government would not bring world peace. So the only form to achieve peace is if all countries are liberal or support all this Reagan-like, not anti-welfare state idea of government. That is the only way we can achieve world peace. According to Howard Walls, those are the two ideologies that have been prioritized by the American foreign policy community. And they have been doing that because that is a great way to keep the American foreign policy community, so the nonprofits and organizations of interest and lobbies working. Walt refers to that amalgamation of groups as the blob. The only way to keep the blob working is to keep those two ideas going. The only way the American foreign policy community is as big as it is because we go from the premise that America is the only one that can lead the world, and it has to show other nations how it is done. It's the idea that it's Americans' responsibility to save underdeveloped countries like my own.
Sophia, we're running into time here. Just wanted to make sure.
Yeah, sorry. So that's the American foreign policy community, and those are my references that I'd be happy to share with you guys. And I would like to thank you all for listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophia. Again, if anybody has questions, just type HR into the chat box, and I'm sure Sophia will be happy to answer them. So I have a question, which is I've read some articles about the role that YouTube in particular played in Bolsonaro's campaign among various social media platforms. And actually the way in which the algorithm that recommends videos to you heavily recommends those videos within Brazil. And I wonder if you've looked into that and how that might have shaped how those audiences grew for those videos and the kind of broad reach that it had, or was it very much targeting particular kinds of people, or what do you know about that?
Most definitely. Actually, it was very difficult to prepare the PowerPoint because the final thesis had like 80 pages, and to just tone that down to a 20-minute presentation was the most challenging part of it all, I think. The whole chapter that there are two chapters that I didn't talk about. One is the contentious history between Brazil and the United States, and how it is not a coincidence that the United States meant so much for those politicians. And the second one is a whole chapter about YouTube. It's actually a whole section of the thesis. The YouTube algorithm, of course, makes people fall into those echo chambers where they only hear more and more of the things they start to believe in. So once you have contact with a few terms about globalism and how the UN is taking over, you fall into a rabbit hole of videos like these. And that's how those communities are created. It is not a coincidence that I had to go back to videos that those YouTubers made in 2015 to be able to understand some of the expressions that they mention. Everything is very coded. Because they are counting on those rabbit holes to be able to function and sustain their communities. They have their own language, they have their own references, and that can only be sustained because the YouTube algorithm is as it is. Another portion of my thesis actually talks about Bolsonaro's opposition and how we have not opened our eyes yet, at least most of us, I believe, for what Bolsonarism really is and how it happened. And I think that also is a testament to how groups that work in opposition to Bolsonaro are also in their own rabbit holes. So by the end of the election, we didn't know what Bolsonarists were talking about because we were in our own bubble. Does that answer your question?
Yes, definitely. It looks like we have another some other questions here. Malia Mungo.
Yes. Hi, Sophia. Congratulations. I'm so happy to see you. I mean, I just wanted to acknowledge that it was super interesting to see that, like, the first bit of your the YouTube focus of your thesis and how that's parallel to the documentary you made, Paper Please. And when I was listening to you, you know, Paper Please, like, you know, the idea of getting married for papers, and like the parallels of globalization and the ideologies that we pick up from media, from YouTube, and you know the role of media to perpetuate these oppressive ideologies. You know, to think that one is better because development aid, or we have to reach this level of developed, whatever that means. And I think I thoroughly enjoyed your research too, and especially in this time of COVID, where all of that is, you know, no way shared in an article. Underdeveloped countries, i.e. the United States, are going to really struggle. There was an article that basically stated that. So I'm curious about all the research that you have in your mind now in this pandemic. How has it affirmed some of the result that you found, or the data that you found, in terms of like the false ideologies of what development actually means? That was a very long-winded, I hope, but it was like, congratulations, and then my question.
First, thank you for your comment. I think that there is an important first section of it, which is you discussed how we are all in a way involved in by that mediated version of the geopolitical north, right? Honestly, what brought me to the United States is not just my undying love for the new school. Like, I wanted to live here. And a part of the fantastic ways in which my research has affected me is that I got to realize just how much of it I reproduce in my own world. And by the end of the research, I want to make it clear that I don't point out the American foreign policy community as a villain. They are just, it's, Walt's book is called The Hell of Good Intentions for a reason. We are trying to make the world better in our own ways, but we are influenced by that polarizing version of that developed countries should save the underdeveloped ones. And you know, I want to be part of the American foreign policy community too. There's nothing I want more than to sit in an ivory tower and discuss about how we can save people, but we gotta be aware of the ways in which we are influenced by those perceptions of how the world works. And that makes me segue, that gives me a segue into your question. And the COVID pandemic has brought a lot of reflections, particularly the idea that this opposition between the United States, the real America, and the communist America is very dangerous. Brazil is threatening to move away from the World Health Organization. And this neoconservative movement that I described here actually happens in other ways in other underdeveloped countries. And we need to pay attention to those movements, because I think Brazil is not going to be the only one that pulls out from the World Health Organization and other international organizations that actually help. So we need to keep our eyes open and try to go into those circles.
Thank you.
Great.